Welcome back to our COG Extra, What's Next for the National Health System. I'm Dr. Jack Kreinler, founder and medical director of the Centre for Health and Human Performance in London. And it's a thrill to be welcoming you from wherever you are in the world today. Please don't forget to take part in the poll for this session. And please also check out the expo and drop a line to some of the brilliant organizations showcasing their innovations there. To the next session, I am beyond delighted to be welcoming someone who I have great admiration for, Christy Watson, who's the author behind the wonderful book, the award-winning 2018 best-selling novel, The Language of Kindness. She's been a nurse of 20 years standing, and she's very kindly joining us here on the COG Extra stage. Her latest book, The Courage to Care, Call for Compassion, is just out in hardback. Is already garnering some tremendous reviews. And here to introduce and interview her is the editor of the Amherst and Telegraph columnist, Rowan Pelling. So over to you, Rowan and Christy.
Hello, and I think I should probably also point out that Christy has just been appointed Professor of Medical and Health Humanities at the University of East Anglia, so she's Professor Watson. Christy, I'd like to start by saying that when I read The Courage to Care, which is such a remarkable book, I thought about the fact that I had actually come across a lot of books by doctors that were quite macho, someone with a scalpel intervening, saving lives. And I hadn't read in such detail about compassion, about caring. Why do you think this side of medical care has been so neglected hitherto?
Well, I think it's a very good question. And when I began researching The Language of Kindness, my last book, I had always loved medical memoir and had read lots and lots of, like you say, books written by doctors. And there's a whole genre of those books, and they're incredible. And I went to the library to see what was available and what was written by a nurse. And I couldn't find anything at all, which is very telling. But actually, there was one nurse's memoir, and that was by Florence Nightingale, which is a bit outdated. But it was quite an astonishing reflection for me, because as a writer of fiction for many years, I hadn't considered writing a memoir. So I think there was something very interesting about the idea of a nurse writer being something quite unusual and shocking. And actually, that in itself is very, very telling about gender. 89% of nurses are women, and almost we think about saving lives and cracking chest and the scalpel and the machoism and all those things about medicine, which is very, very important. But nurses too are also saving lives and have an incredible role, both in that side of things, but also, like you said, in the compassionate care delivery of sometimes a quiet but no less powerful and no less meaningful profession. So I felt really compelled to write this nurse's book, and the last one as well. And hopefully there'll be a barrage of nursing memoir coming away now.
One of the things you seem to set out to do with this book is to show that while we tend to think of nurses in a hospital setting, that actually nursing reaches into every level of society. I mean, what were some of the more unusual areas of nursing that you explored?
Well, I was lucky enough to spend about 18 months traveling around the world and really getting to know nurses from all walks of life. And there are nurses cobwebbing our country and our world, working with the most vulnerable people among us. Everywhere there are people, there are nurses. And that's perhaps a unique job. But there are nurses, for example, that I describe in The Courage to Care, who are working in the military, in schools, in prisons, in forensic justice settings, in hospices, in care homes, everywhere that you can possibly imagine. And I learned a lot researching this book as well, because I very much had the perspective before of a nurse in hospital, in uniform. And of course, there's a whole other world of nursing out there. And perhaps these nurses at this time are going to be even more relevant than ever as we move through the pandemic.
Were there any particular stories that stood out to you as emblematic of the book's themes?
I mean, there's a story that I set in critical care, which basically was when I looked after a patient. I named her Gwen in the book, and she was suffering from acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a really awful lung condition, not unlike COVID, and was ventilated and had numerous pieces of equipment around her. She was on the highest doses of inotropes, the strong heart drugs we could give, and we really believed, all of us, that she might not make it. And her husband didn't get to the hospital in time, or we thought he couldn't. And I remember thinking that at that time, perhaps the most profound thing was that she was never alone, even when her husband couldn't get there, because the nurse who was looking after her alongside me and the whole team saw that there was somebody holding her hand, somebody seeing past her hospitalization and illness and getting to know the person that she was. And luckily her husband made it. But I think this year, perhaps for all of us, we've struggled. We might not be there when our loved ones are sick and dying, but of course we're never ever alone because we have nurses, and it's really important to hang on and remember that.
You make a very strong and passionate case in the book that there should be a nurse on stage. Were you very shocked to find out
Rowan.
That's all right. Were you shocked to find out that there wasn't a nurse on stage? Hi, Christy, struggling with your connection a bit, I think, there.
Question. Yeah, I think for all of us, I mean, I truly passionately believe that had there been a care home nurse, for example, on the SAGE advisory committee involved in policy, then we would have saved far more lives. And it is so vitally important that we have those nurses' voices in government. Nurses are expert organisers of crises. That's their job. And obviously they have more expertise, for example, in the care home setting than any other profession.
You make a big case for the fact that, you know, we tend to underestimate nurses, and they're very rigorously trained. And maybe talk us through some of what's required for you, and you've gone back to the front line over the COVID crisis as a critical care nurse. I think your connection's gone down a bit. Are you still with us, Christy?
I'm here, yeah.
Sorry, did you hear that? Yeah, I was saying you make a very good case in the book for how rigorously trained and academic nurses have to be. So it's not just making beautiful beds and mopping brows. It's really rigorous and academic. And I thought, because you've gone back to the front line and you're involved in critical care, there's an awful lot of training involved, isn't there? And you make the point that we were actually massively understaffed during the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, according to NHS England, we're 38,000 nurses short in August this year, and a third of nurses are currently considering leaving the profession as we head into winter, which is quite a terrifying prospect for all of us. And yes, I was one of the 14,000 nurses that went back to join this emergency COVID register to work on the front line. But even with those numbers, and many of them, like me, are working for the first period, then unable to continue their straits and the Royal College of Nursing is campaigning for a 12.5% pay rise for nurses right now, and we really do need it right now because so many are considering leaving the profession.
One of the points that you make movingly in the book is about the fact that nurses are critically involved in the fight against racism, structural racism, institutional racism. How do you think that's affected your work within the NHS? Hi, can you hear me?
Well, I think nurses, nursing, yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, can you hear me? Apologies, everyone. These are our times. Nurses have always been, and the profession is much more than saving lives or even just giving meaning to lives. It's also about human rights and social justice and fighting inequality. And obviously part of that is fighting racism. But there is, we have a massive problem even within the NHS of structural racism, as we do in all other areas of our country. And I think that nurses should absolutely fight and speak up against this. And they've always championed people, and they will continue to champion people, and is a huge part of a nurse's job, is actually fighting inequality in all its forms.
Your book has a really interesting structure. I mean, in a way, it's telling the story of all sorts of nursing, but it's also a memoir. It's very personal. How did you come up with that quite complex structure and decide that was the way to tell the story of perhaps modern Britain in a way, because you're both a patient and a nurse?
I think for me, the architecture of non-fiction is a baffling beast, and the structure is always the part that I find the most difficult in every book, really. But with fiction, I sort of meander and go in and out of memory and just see what happens. And I was under the impression that I might be able to do that with non-fiction too, which is absolutely the wrong thing. And it's very, very important to have some kind of clear structure. And I would like to say that the structure came first and then I was able to fit everything in. But for me, I think as a novelist, I approached it in a very long-winded way and ended up doing draft after draft after draft before I finally came upon the idea that we are also interconnected. We are also dependent, even if we're independent. And I wanted to talk about community and family, as well as nurses and nurses' families, and how everything links. And so I had to weave in my personal story and my family's story, because obviously my family, like every single family, has been impacted by professional expertise and care and compassion of nurses.
You start the book with the story of your daughter's birth. I thought it was very interesting how, and I'd never really considered this, that when you're a doctor or a nurse, you see your baby's even more vulnerable. You think about the hundreds and hundreds of terrible things that could happen. I mean, that must be a very difficult thing to deal with as a new mother.
Yeah, as nurses tend to make the worst patients, which I think is probably true. I suppose you can't unsee the things that you see, and obviously it tends to go one way or another. A friend of mine who's a medic said that you either become hyper vigilant or totally horizontally relaxed. I've got that very sort of nurse mentality now, where unless you're bleeding in front of me, then you will go to school.
There's a good question come in from a member of the viewing audience, David Jackson. He asks, is there value in blending the roles of nurse manager and leader with RGN staff nurse roles? Would it give them a stronger voice?
So I think in terms of the question about the role of nurse manager and leader, blending it with staff nurse roles, I think that staff nurses and registered nurses are leaders and they are managers. The deficit that we have and the issue we have is they don't have enough of a voice. Nurses from all backgrounds need more of a voice, both in media but also in government. And I think that's the key thing that we need to see. The public know that nurses are the most trusted of professions, and they have expertise in the areas of the world that we need expertise in right now. Nurses have been at the forefront of this pandemic. They've been saving lives. The lack of critical care nurses has been one of the most significant factors this year, and challenges. And as we go forwards over the next few years, it will be nurses who bear the weight of COVID and all the other conditions that we're going to see. A generation of our children, mental illness, care of our elderly populations, people who've been suffering cancer, and all the other things that are happening this year. And so it is nurses who are the most expert people that we need to listen to during a pandemic. And I have yet to see nurses have a seat from every background. And I'm talking about care home nurses, district nurses, cancer nurses. We need to see these frontline leaders, as they already are, involved in policy. And that's so vital for all of us.
I'd like to talk a little about the kindest nurse in Britain, because
I'm hoping that you can hear me now, and apologies for all these technical glitches.
Who is your kindest nurse? Because there's one person who gets the accolade. Can you hear me, Christy?
Yeah, the kindest nurse. You're asking who is the kindest nurse that I met during the book research. So I think you can hear me. I can't hear you very well, but I'm going to go ahead and carry on talking. So apologies if I'm waffling on. But the kindest nurse that I met, and I describe in the book, it was a nurse that I met. She was described to me as the kindest nurse in Britain. And so we travelled quite a long way to Scotland to go and meet her and spend some time with her. And she is a parish nurse working in a local church with homeless people. And I spent the day with her while she was giving them soup and helping them with healthcare services. And she said a lot of these people that she's working with have addiction issues. They might be ex-prisoners, they might have convictions of the worst crimes you could possibly imagine. But she said, we just leave that at the door, because here we're just people. And if we're too busy judging them, then we can't really love them. And honestly, there was something about this nurse that just, I saw these people just relax. She ended up putting karaoke on for them in the afternoon, which again doesn't seem like much of a nursing job. But if you'd seen what happened in that room, there was a grace about it. There was something extraordinary about what she was doing for these people. And she said that sometimes they go to a funeral every couple of weeks. And these are people that she's been working with for years and years and years. And I just thought she was absolutely incredible. And there are so many stories like that within nursing, of nurses going above and beyond and just doing incredible work with people that the rest of society seems to have forgotten. She was quite inspirational and remarkable.
On that theme, I was also very struck by the story about the forensic nurse who you interviewed in the book.
The forensic nurse specialist. So she, again, so Jess was the forensic nurse that I speak about in the book, and she, again, another remarkable human being. She works predominantly in police cells with people who've been, who might have committed crime, and also victims of people who might have been victims. But she basically, her job is to work with people in such a non-judgmental way who might have committed or been accused of committing the most terrible of all crimes. And she sees her role very much about making sure people are in the best possible state of health so that they can face a fair trial, and that justice and truth, who are working, for example, like Jess is, in the pursuit of justice and truth, and having so much influence over people's care, caring for those who I suppose most of us would find it really, really difficult to care for, and doing it for all the right reasons.
So I find it hard to type, but hopefully you can hear me. You yourself have a sort of personal where you have a struggle with a very difficult situation that you have to deal with, the result, a child who suffered through domestic violence, a premature baby, and yet you, in that situation, you do find the compassion and courage to care. Can we talk through that process a bit, how you managed to find compassion for that father?
Well, I think that my Achilles heel in nursing is trying to be non-judgmental to people that I know have been abusive in some way. And it is the job of the nurse to be non-judgmental in all situations. But of course, we're human beings. We're not robots. And there are personal feelings always going to come to work in the way that they do with every job. But you just have to keep a professional tone in everything. And I remember looking after the baby, and he was very, very sick, premature, tiny, again on the edge of life. And his dad had been allowed out from prison to go and see him as a kind of final, maybe potentially even a goodbye. And I really struggled initially caring for not only the baby, but this man, because obviously when you're a nurse, you care for the families equally in the same way that you care for your patients. But then to actually see his fragility and his vulnerability, and really he wasn't a monster as I initially thought. He was just a broken, quite pathetic man who had been dealt a hand of cards that I can't even imagine. And I suppose what I wanted to explore philosophically in the book is how any one of us could be any type of person given the right circumstances. And he sang his son a song, Danny Boy, actually, while he held him and was crying. And I remember thinking and wondering about whether his dad had sang him that song, and then what kind of man his dad was and his dad before him. And so I think nursing is very much about looking at a much broader, bigger picture. And that really helped me with the idea of judgment or non-judgment.
I was saying when we have one of our glitches that it's a very poetic book. And one of the things you talk about, you use the Thames as a kind of metaphor for tidal flow of history. And you say at one point, you feel we're flowing backwards towards Dickensian times. Why do you feel it's getting so dark?
I think that pre-pandemic, we were in dire straits after 10 years of austerity, and our most vulnerable people were suffering. And now we will suffer more, and it will be our most vulnerable people, sadly, who suffer even more. And of course, the deaths from things that are related to the economy and things like cancer are going to be profound and tragic, and it will be nurses who bear the weight of this, I think. There's been some sense of our shifting in our value system this year towards community and the idea of people caring for their neighbours and thinking of other families as well as their own. And I really hope that we hold on to that, the idea that we are all actually dependent on each other, and we are global, and the things that mattered to us before, stuff, looks, status, those things don't really matter at all. It's about kindness and compassion, and I really hope that we hang on to that.
It would be nice to have an optimistic moment too, because I was trying to explain when you disappeared for a bit that there's a very beautiful thing you write about the golden hour. Hello, have I lost you again? Would you be able to explain the golden hour?
So I think you're asking me about the golden hour. And I met an artist at a medical humanities conference, actually, and she was talking about why she paints and why she does what she does. And I was thinking, why do nurses do what they do? And the two things came together, and she was saying that she only paints during dusk because that's when the light is the most beautiful. And I thought, well, actually, I think nurses work in these situations of life and death and the in-between, because that's when human beings become their most beautiful and we really see what's important in life.
And on that note, maybe the end of the story where there's a beautiful kiss, because it's something I think I'm going to take away from that book, how we should treat the people we love most. Because when this patient doesn't die and she's suffering from COVID and she's really ill, the reunion with her husband is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, it was back to Gwen in intensive care, and she basically, I remember started to notice things like she had a bumblebee tattoo, and it turned out her and her husband were both beekeepers, and she had really beautiful hair, and we started noticing more and more about her, even though she was hooked up to all these monitors. And that really is the job of a nurse, to think about the clues that make us human. And eventually her husband made it, and whether she lived or not, he got there in time. And I remember watching him pulling the curtains round, and he kissed her like he was never going to get the chance to kiss her again. And I think that all of us at the moment really should take away from this year that we don't know what's around the corner, but what we can do is love like we might never get the chance to, hug our children, hug our family members, and just really be the best people we can. And I think that kiss I'll never ever forget.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to end the session, because we all really need to sort of absorb that and take that lesson away. Thank you so much, Christy, for talking today and for putting such a passionate case for nurses being given more stature and also having a place on stage. I hope everyone's going to campaign for that.
Thank you.
And now I think we are going to... Yeah,
thank you. And apologies about the technical issue.
Thanks everyone for bearing with the glitches. And I think now we're handing back to Dr. Jack.
Thank you. I can't thank you both enough for that session. Extremely moving. I do not think anyone was at all bothered actually by the technical difficulties that we had, but sorry for them. Everything came across just as it should. I distinctly remember my first night on call on my 23rd birthday, when I first became a doctor, and going up to the sister at the emergency department at the Whittington Hospital and just saying, I know nothing, teach me everything that I can know, not only about how to treat people, but how to care for them. And probably my best mentor, my greatest mentor ever since. Health is not just about diagnostics and medicine, which technology can help, but about kindness and care that technology can never replace. So thank you very much both to Christy and Rowan for that. And most importantly, don't forget to look up Christy's book, The Courage to Care, A Call for Compassion. It is out in hardback now. I have just got myself a copy on Amazon. We're going to take a short break. Do grab a coffee and check your emails, or check your coffee and grab your emails, whichever you like. But make sure you're back here at 11:15 for our next session that Tabitha will introduce, when we'll be exploring how data and AI will shape the NHS in future. Thank you very much for joining.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.